Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound. It's a show that aims to provide hope and avenue for healing, and one that will help you understand and then live the great mercy of God. Today, I have with me Kristen Thierault. She did a show with us several weeks ago. I also suggest you look up on Eucharistic Miracles. Um, she wasn't married then, so it's Kirsten Van Uden, but it's the same wonderful, young, hardworking lady here who's written this beautiful book entitled When the Sickle Swings, and then Stories of Catholics Who Survived Communist Oppression. Kristen, the book's going to be out shortly. People can pre-order it now at
Right.
sophiainstitute.com.
That's right. The official release date is next week, November 21st, but if you pre-order it now, it is in the warehouse, so you'll probably get it a few days early.
Okay. Could you hold up it's not the real book, but it's a colored copy of the book cover?
Sure. So this is my mock-up copy right here with all of my notes and marginalia on the side. So really love the cover. They did a great job with that. It's very, very powerful with the imagery.
And it's got your maiden name on it, so not
It
the
does. Yes, it's under Kristen Van Uden. So probably you have not seen another Van Uden before. So something that sticks in the memory.
Now, I'm just going to read from some of the things in the book, but you write for over half of the 20th century, across nearly half the globe, the Catholic faith was repressed, restricted, or outright illegal. Since 1917, the atheistic false messianic doctrine of communism found its expression in state powers whose promises of equality for all routinely descended into totalitarianism, slavery, and slaughter. The Catholic Church was a principal target of these regimes. From secret masses in the prisons of Cuba, which we're going to focus a lot on today, to clandestine clergy in the catacombs of Bratislava, to showdowns of the Soviet tanks on the streets of Rome, Catholics resisted communist persecution in every way they could. So we're going to talk about Catholicism and how it's antithetical to communism. And Kristen, I want to congratulate you on the book and welcome back to Mercy Unbound.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back again so quickly.
You've done a lot of homework in this book. It's obvious with the photos and the references and things. And what led you to write this book?
So this is something that has been on my mind for a very long time. I grew up reading stories of totalitarianism and resilience during war. So I was very interested in the Holocaust from a very young age, for example. And when I discovered that Catholics had actually been persecuted quite recently throughout the 20th century under both the Nazi and Soviet and other communist regimes as well, this was something that was kind of a shock to me because it's not widely publicized. It's kind of this unknown persecution that that wording that I chose for the back of the book, that for over half of the century across nearly half of the globe, our faith was persecuted within some of our lifetimes. And the Soviet Union itself just fell 30 years ago. There are still communist countries, and we'll get into a little bit of the persecution going on in China currently. Cuba still remains a communist country. And so this is something that I just felt was a story that needed to be told. And the focus of the book is on narrativizing oral histories that I conducted, interviews that I conducted with these survivors, these eyewitnesses to these events. I have always accessed history the best through these individual stories because you can read statistics all day, you can understand themes and economics and all of these more macro categories for studying a period. But what really sticks in my memory, at least, is these personal stories. This is kind of the entire function of the saints as well, is to provide these personal icons of grace where we can see God working in the individual lives and people who are every day waking up and making their own choices to lead them to either to the kingdom of heaven or ultimately to hell. And this is really the only way that we access the world is as individuals. And so just like reading biographies of the saints, I found these personal stories to be very inspiring and very relatable. I think there's something in this book for everyone because not all of us will be called to a red martyrdom of execution, which of course did happen to many people under communism, but we are all called to some degree of white martyrdom, and it's those daily choices and actions that really amount to a full life of holiness. And we have examples from all across the spectrum featured in this book. And I just think that it's something that is an important historical record. As someone who studies the 20th century, much of my sources consist of these non-documentary sources. So when you're suffering under under a persecution, for example, not everyone has time to write that down. There are fewer documents produced, and oftentimes a lot of the evidence we have does reside within this oral record. So hoping to bring light to that.
Let's start with Cuba. Of course, it's so close to the United States, only 90 miles away, and living in Florida, I actually have been to Cuba a couple times. We were doing missionary work there, and I can tell you that the island itself is beautiful. It's a beautiful island. I was fascinated. I remember one instance where we were staying in a hotel, and looking out, you see the beautiful ocean, and yet there were no boats. And then it hit me, well, there's no boats because the people would get in the boat and take off. It was sad to think that way, but the people, these beautiful homes, like say some beautiful mansions here in Florida, they had them all over Cuba, but they weren't mansions anymore. They were full of 10 families, split up. They hadn't been painted in 50 years. I remember years ago, a actor here in the States talked about we need free healthcare like Cuba. Well, the healthcare can be free, but it's so what if you don't have antibiotics or bandages or towels? Tell us a little about who really was Castro. What was he like?
Yes, so I start the book with these testimonies from Cuba right away after the introduction in chapter 2. And by the way, I would love to hear more about your experience there someday. That must have been just incredible to see parts of the real Cuba and not just the Potemkin village that they showed the world. But I start this chapter with a story that I heard from several people that I interviewed that I think is very revelatory to what the Castro regime stood for. So I'll just tell this story that I call the poison apple, if you don't mind, in a few minutes. Basically, what this entailed was really a campaign of propaganda and brainwashing that occurred at the elementary schools. So starting to force this ideology of communism right away and form the next generation of true believers. And what the teachers who, in order to be a teacher, you had to show some degree of faith to the party. So either be a party member, this was pretty consistent across the board, or go along with their ideology. So what these communist teachers would do is to tell the children to stand up and all close their eyes and stick out their hands and then ask God for a piece of candy. And of course, nothing happened. So the minutes would tick by, people would get impatient. And then the teacher said, okay, now ask Fidel for a piece of candy. And magically, lo and behold, after they did that, the teachers all walked along the line and gave them a piece of candy. So really, the message that's being conveyed here is that God is dead. He's a figment of your imagination, and your parents' faith is backwards. And rather, Castro and the state are the ones who are able to provide for you and provide hope for the future. So it's this very insidious ideology that goes beyond merely a political or an economic program and really seeks to, as Stalin famously said, engineer souls in this new way where the state takes the place of God. In Fidel Castro's case, this was a bit more complicated than in other communist regimes because he outright lied about the nature of his revolution in the first months after taking over. The Batista regime, which was before him, was quite unpopular among a lot of demographics, so there was a lot of hope in the revolution. And unfortunately, it was hijacked by his communist goals. And one gentleman I interviewed named Arturo remembers being able to see through Castro's lies right from the very beginning. And that's in part because he was able to access Western media. So he read Reader's Digest that his neighbor got in the mail. And he read about what was going on in Eastern Europe. And I think he read specifically about Cardinal Mindszenty and realized what communism was and what it did to the church. And it was imprisoning these holy men. And he kind of took the pulse on communism and had it figured out and could see many similarities with Castro's rhetoric. So he did not fall for this, but this duplicity that Castro had at the beginning helped him to really seize power in this very comprehensive way. And of course, as we know, Cuba still remains a communist country. Both the Castro brothers are dead, but unfortunately it has not yet recovered from this blight. And so a lot of these things, while they're not going on at the same degree or necessarily in the same way, they're still representative of this ideology. And of course, this has been a movement for many Americans as well. And of course, those of Cuban descent to continue to advocate for a free Cuba.
Didn't Castro have a Catholic education, though?
He did, yes. He went to a Jesuit school, and interestingly enough, many of the anti-communist freedom fighters also went to this school, Belen Jesuit, I believe, and also there was La Salle, which was a Christian Brothers school that produced a lot of these very strong Catholic freedom fighters. But it's so ironic that he had such a solid Catholic education and just none of it sunk in, and he found it easy to trade that for personal gain and power.
And he oppressed many people, didn't he? It wasn't just a handful. He put them in prison or whatever.
That's right. It's very difficult sometimes in communist regimes to parse what a person's actual quote unquote crime against the state was, because many of these were trumped up charges. An interesting charge that was levied against Catholics in communist regimes around the world was that of being either a counter-revolutionary or a fifth columnist for the Vatican, or an agent for the Vatican, which is interesting because there's this, while of course, and we'll get into the ideological reasons for this, communism is opposed to religion on principle, the Catholic Church also has this other target on its back, in that the Vatican is a sovereign state and the Pope is the head of that sovereign state. So they would invent reasons for arresting these ideological enemies, basically. And counter-revolutionary activity was really anything. It was a catch-all phrase that could mean anything from speaking poorly of the regime to, and your neighbor turned you in, hearing that, to actively joining a freedom fighting movement, anything really in that realm. So the entire country was oppressed in this way, in this forcing of an ideological lockstep that caused people to live in fear, to inform on their neighbors, or to live in constant panic that they would be informed upon. But the Catholic persecution took on a particular flavor. At one point, several hundred priests were actually deported to Spain. And we can go into a bit later the 5 steps that I identify that communist regimes typically take against the church, which includes the seizure of property and the reappropriation of property. So this is a big theme of my book, is how the Catholic Church is a specific target that goes beyond just the typical oppression of their own people that communist regimes tend to take.
And he took many people's total life belongings, didn't he? He just took it over as the state, and we're going to distribute it evenly and everything's going to be fine.
Yes, that's a principle of communism, that there is no private property. So property of individuals and of organizations, and the church falls into this, was seized and repurposed for various and sundry, often wasteful uses. So the tragedy of collective farming in the Soviet Union, for example, is something that just, it's completely inefficient, in addition to being obviously wrong for seizing people's property and for stealing in that way. Someone I interviewed from Cuba named Polo actually has a memory of Che Guevara himself coming onto his father's property and basically seizing the property and requisitioning it for the government. And of course, they did not go down without a fight. They didn't believe this. They were not communists, and they knew this was wrong. And Che actually offered them some government bonds in recompense for this land. It's like, that's worthless, because this communist economy is in shambles. So there's always this veneer of legality that they will take to try to have plausible deniability of having done anything wrong, really. But we we can see right through that. And obviously for the people whose entire livelihoods were destroyed, it is even more immediate.
Go back to some of those other principles you were going to talk about, the typical communism and their ruses to do whatever they want.
Sure. So, for the purpose of evaluating the Catholic experience under communism, I was able to identify 5 broad principles or tactics that the communist governments took against the church specifically. And these were implemented in different ways. So, you won't see them exactly tracking in everyone's experience, but they're definitely good categories with which to approach this subject and to really categorize this huge period. The first one is to outlaw, or at the very least discourage, the public worship of the church. So this includes the sacraments and also, interestingly enough, public processions. So this happened in Cuba. Several people I interviewed remember strong memories from their childhood of having Marian processions, feast day, rosary processions. That was all brought to an end after Castro took over. And this is the same in other communist countries, especially in Czechoslovakia as well, that I also focused on. The sacraments obviously were targeted. In Czechoslovakia. The bishops were a prime target, and actually the Eastern Catholics in that country lost about 75% of their bishops. They were just murdered by the state. It's this principle that, as we hear in scripture, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Of course, they're trying to cut off the lifeblood of the church and make apostolic succession pretty much impossible. But we will see that thanks to heroic Catholics and also the support of Pius XII and the popes after, we were able to, of course, persevere, and apostolic succession did not die out. Also, communist regimes always seek to implement almost a state religious calendar. So they replace the feast days and the processions with these state holidays. It really serves as kind of a pseudo religion. So there are like May Day, Labor Day, for example, on May 1st was a very big communist holiday. They would have, depending on the culture in the Soviet Union, for example, there's Victory Day to mark the end of World War II. And these kind of fill that need for ritual and trying to trick the people out of the fact that they have lost their liturgical calendar. Second tactic is to round up physically the clergy and religious. So, as I previously mentioned, many priests were deported from Cuba for their activities of just living their vocation. In Czechoslovakia, this took the form of 2 operations by the military and secret police called Operation K and Operation R. These are after the Czech words klastieri and reholnica, which means monks and nuns. And during these really horrible human rights violations, thousands of monks and nuns were rounded up, taken from their convents and monasteries, placed into collective housing and sometimes imprisoned. And then many of them were pressed into forced labor after that. There was, I found an interview with a nun who had undergone this, and she actually recounted having to work in these just poor conditions, including the workers undressing in front of her, and just really not the proper place for a nun to be, obviously. So again, this is targeting the clergy. After that, they move on to the laity a bit. But number 3 is kind of a crossover. So the third thing that communist regimes do is to seize and repurpose church property. We touched on this a bit before. This has a manifold purpose. Number 1 is to enrich the party and the state by seizing the material treasures of the church, and also to maintain control over the buildings and the places of worship in service of their first point, which is to halt the actions of worship. They can be used as anything. In the Soviet Union, a lot of Orthodox monasteries were actually used as prisons. And so basically just taking the church's property out of its hands. And then number 4 is to control the laity. So this is that system of informing and societal pressure that is hard to really put a finger on, but that amounts to basically an extended peer pressure through coercion, blackmail, bribes, and incentives to get people to either apostatize or to downplay their faith. So one example of this comes from someone I interviewed from Czechoslovakia, whose father was a university professor, and they noticed one day outside of church that there were informants stationed there to report on him and his activities by going to mass. And of course, that would all go into your file and would be a black mark against your name whenever you went up for a promotion. So really utilizing all of this softer pressure that could really make or break your status socially and economically. And then finally, the fifth and perhaps most insidious tactic was infiltration. So to infiltrate the church hierarchy and to place state and party loyal men in these positions, to convert certain clergy to the cause and then to promote them and give them opportunities while suppressing those voices that remained loyal to the church. And depending on the country, this could even take the form of a national church, similar to what we see in China. So that is what happened in Czechoslovakia. About 11% of priests became loyal to the state rather than to the Vatican. And those who were loyal to the Vatican had to go underground in their operations. They were not supported in their public ministry. So this is kind of the blueprint that we see play out, and again takes on a different form depending on where you are, but kind of 5 benchmarks we can use to determine what's going on.
Kristen, you delved into the Bay of Pigs quite a bit. You visited several people involved in that, and a lot of points here I'm throwing at you, but can you share with us some of their stories and about the Marian Chapel down in Miami and how all this ties in, and Marian apparition, or I should say the story of Mary found by 2 fishermen?
Yes. So I was very privileged last year to travel down to Miami and meet in person with a lot of survivors of communism, several who were political prisoners not tied to the Bay of Pigs, and then at the Bay of Pigs Museum, many veterans of that invasion and part of the Brigade 2506. So that was really amazing, just this living testimony to their experiences. As I discuss in the book, Catholic resistance to communism took on a more militant form in Cuba, and this is in large part due to the Catholic action organizations that existed there, which arose from these 2 Catholic schools that we discussed before. And they also were aided by American intelligence because of the strategic role that Cuba played in the Cold War. So of course we know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Bay of Pigs invasion was again one of those one of those kind of ideas that was supported by the US until, of course, when it actually happened, and then unfortunately did not receive the air support that was promised. And so there were oftentimes under communism, it was very difficult to resist. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about this, of how gradual and totalizing the control was, so that by the time you realized something was happening, there was really nothing you can do. And the organs of state power were just so comprehensive and so baked into every element of society that it was not like what we see with the partisans during World War II resisting the Nazis, for example. There were not as many opportunities to fight back. But Cuba did have this opportunity, and the veterans that I talked to, you'll see at the shrine of Our Lady down there, La Virgen del Cobre, they have one of these sort of battle cries of Dios, Patria y Vida, of course, in the correct order: God, fatherland, and life. And they would sacrifice their lives, obviously, first and foremost for their faith, but also for patriotism, for their country, and are very proud of how these 2 go hand in hand. Also, interestingly, I did find that this sort of blurry line between political and religious persecution and also political and religious resistance is oftentimes what makes it so hard for the canonization process of many of these people to move forward, because like Thomas More, for example, or the martyrs of the French Revolution, it's sometimes hard to tell if these people were persecuted for religious reasons. But of course, our religion makes it so that we must participate in the world. We don't live in cloisters, meant most of us, of course, the laity. And so I found definitely those two go hand in hand, especially among the Cuban community. The story of the shrine, as you mentioned, is very interesting. So one of the patrons of Cuba is Our Lady of Charity, and who also goes by the name of the Virgin of Cobre. And this is a devotion that actually predates communism for the Cuban people. She it's sort of an apparition, but not quite. It's a miraculous image in a way. There, as the story goes, there were three men who were shipwrecked, and they go by the three Juans, even though not all of them were named Juan. And they saw this item floating towards them as all hope was lost on the high seas. And as it got closer, they noticed it was a painting, and ultimately discovered that it was a painting of Our Lady. And so they just threw themselves on Our Lady's intercession and ultimately were saved. And so she is honored under that title and credited with saving the lives of these three men. And so this became a devotion in Cuba. And then, of course, the Cuban people took this devotion wherever they traveled. So at the training camps in the Florida Keys, actually, there was sort of a makeshift shrine to Our Lady as well. And then in Miami, for the diaspora, this shrine was built and is sort of one of the cultural centers for the Cuban people there. Sunflowers are brought to Our Lady as one of the great offerings to her. So you'll see the whole place is just covered in sunflowers. At least it was when I was there. And it's poetic, I think, and very fitting that Our Lady saved these three men from drowning, because it brings images of those who escaped Cuba and were forced to escape on boats, and how she leads them to freedom and safety and life here in the US. So that is a through line that's very beautiful in that continued devotion.
You know, when I think of how much suffering people have gone through over the years with these dictatorships, and I mean, the numbers are hard to believe when you read, you know, maybe Mao Zedong killed 1 million people. And
50 million.
it's like, wow. And then I think the United States, and we're just so used to having everything, and a grocery store filled with goods, and gasoline available and everything. And I think, I don't know how long we'd survive if we were put to the test, like these people you mentioned in your book.
Right. And that is something that I really discovered in every country, is this gratitude for the sacraments, especially, and how the very basic life of the church was limited in such a way that we take for granted here in our daily lives. We can go to daily mass. All that prevents us is our own schedules and convenience. But this was something that was not possible for the majority of Catholics under these regimes. And one aspect of, particularly the sacraments, that I found very inspiring was the various ways that Catholics would get very creative in order to make sure that they were living a sacramental life. One story that occurred again and again in the prison camps in Cuba, and heard this from political prisoners, and also this was echoed by the Bay of Pigs veterans, was that of these secret masses in the prisons. So oftentimes there would be a priest interned in one of these prison camps in one of the circulars, so that basically the floors were separated. And so when a priest was available, and if he was able to obtain the proper matter, he would be able to say mass on Sundays. Also, when families visited, they sometimes would smuggle in the Eucharist to their loved ones in the prison. But even when there was no priest, the Catholic prisoners would often say the words of the Mass amongst themselves, either through a missal that had been smuggled in or just from memory. And when they got to the point of the consecration, they would just bow their heads and make a spiritual communion, and then continue on in order to keep their Sunday obligation in that way, which was just amazing because, of course, this could bring reprisals from the guards and all sorts of punishments and risks associated with that. Also, in somewhat of a different situation, but similar principles, in Czechoslovakia, going to the underground church proved to be quite an ordeal because since there was this percentage of priests who were loyal to the state, you had to be very careful with vetting where you went to mass. And sadly, even according to some reports, some of these state priests would sometimes even break the seal of confession in order to inform on a penitent. So the one woman that I interviewed recounts having to keep her eyes down at mass so that if she was hauled before state security, she could tell them, I didn't recognize anybody else there. I don't know the identity of the priest, just to have that security built in to protect the community and to ensure that the sacraments could continue. And it's, when you think about it, a lot of pressure placed on the laity that we typically don't and shouldn't have to deal with, because we shouldn't really have to vet each priest and make sure that they are actually remaining Catholic and remaining loyal to the Vatican. And that's something we take for granted now. I mean, of course, with some of the ideological corruption that has occurred in the West, we see this a little bit with, if we hear something from the pulpit that we're like, that doesn't sound Catholic, you have to do a little bit of research there. But really nothing like this, where it was this full-time job to just make sure that you were not putting your soul in danger, but were still able to receive the sacraments whenever you could. So this, again, this something that is just a routine in our lives that was made exceedingly difficult for these people.
You have a lot of photographs in the book of people you've spoken to, and share with us one or two of the people you spoke to or heard stories about from Czechoslovakia and their struggles, what they had to go through.
Sure. So let's see. One of the interviews that I conducted that was really quite fascinating was with a gentleman named František Mikloško, and he is now a politician in Slovakia. And he was a student at the time of his involvement with the underground church in Czechoslovakia, and his testimony was incredible. He worked with Jan Chrysostom Korec, who later became a cardinal under John Paul II. And one of the pictures in the book that was courtesy of him was of Cardinal, then Bishop Korec, with this apparatus that he had put together in order to communicate secretly with other members of the underground church. So it was kind of like it's hard to describe, but it was like an ear trumpet. So one person would speak into one side, and then somebody would be listening on the other side, and they'd be sitting right next to each other. But this was because he knew that his apartment was probably bugged by the STB, the secret police there. So just these very kind of John le Carré methods that you would expect to see in a spy novel, but that became part of the daily activities of those in the underground church trying to avoid detection. Bishop Korec and also many in the Czechoslovak underground church had to have full-time jobs. Many secret priests had to make a living and had to hide the fact that they were priests because they were in imminent danger of arrest, torture, and persecution, and even martyrdom. And they had factory work and really just these unglamorous day-to-day jobs. And then their true vocation would happen after that. One thing that I found really inspiring was that Pius XII in 1949 actually issued what are called the secret mandates. So these basically gave carte blanche permission to all bishops under the Iron Curtain, so wherever that was in the world, to ordain priests and consecrate bishops without explicit permission from the Vatican. And this, of course, was outside of the bounds of ordinary jurisdiction, but it was a huge help to save apostolic succession in this time, because in this digital age, we don't really understand that when the lines of communication were shut down by a government, it was actually quite difficult to get any information in and out. And so they did truly live in this sort of information blackout. So any missive from the Vatican and any personnel sent would be almost hopeless to get through. So they had to work really in these dire situations. And so, of course, full seminary training was not possible in those situations. They would select the best possible candidates, and they would be quickly put through the process of ordination and proliferate the growth of the church there. So this was really a grace. It was abused in certain circumstances by some unscrupulous priests who ordained people who really shouldn't have been ordained. But the segment of the underground church that Bishop Koretz was involved with, and that I interviewed people who were involved with, really took great pains to act responsibly with this power vested in them by the Pope.
Well, it seemed to me that the church was like one step ahead of them, because they would, put people in prison or kill them, but the bishop had appointed other priests to take over, or they maybe appoint this one a bishop, and I thought that's brilliant.
Yes. Yes, it was almost the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church in real time. You could see it actually, the fruits of that within the same lifetime.
Now, who was father? Is it Toufar?
Toufar. Mm-hmm.
Share that story.
Sure. So I think I mentioned this briefly on our last podcast, but Father Toufar was a priest who was involved in a purported Eucharistic miracle in the late 1940s in a small Slovak town of Chihost. And this incident ended up playing a large role in an attempted communist propaganda film, and later resulted in Father Toufar's martyrdom. So basically what happened was, the Christmas Day, during the consecration of the host, the crucifix behind the altar swayed all the way to the left and then back all the way to the right, and came to rest in the middle, sort of at an angle. And so it obviously signified a sign of the cross over the congregation. And so some people, of course, were a little bewildered and inspired by this, but really kind of moved on with their lives. And then it happened again within a week. And so at this point, it was something brought to the attention of the priest and was going to be elevated to the bishop for some sort of investigation. Of course, once word got out, the communist authorities also caught wind of this, and they felt very threatened and could not have this getting to the people. This speaks to kind of their hypocrisy, that if Catholicism and religion in general is just something that's backwards and fake, and they have this purely materialist worldview, why would they be so concerned to disprove a miracle? So it's like that Polish Rationalist Association we talked about last time. They're very concerned with anything that challenges their materialist worldview. So Father Toufar was targeted. He was paid a visit by the secret police. They actually tried to get him to participate in a propaganda film that they decided to make about the incident, in which they would prove that he had faked this miracle by a complex set of pulleys that he would pull at the opportune moment and move the cross. And of course, he had not done this, so he refused on principle to admit to something he had not done, and to lie and to scandalize the faithful and make them really doubt their faith in this way. And so he was arrested for this refusal. He was beaten, sadly, and then ultimately he did succumb to his injuries. So I think he is a martyr if we have ever seen one, and there have been intimations of his canonization, but as far as I've seen, that hasn't moved forward in a concrete way just yet. The state went on to actually produce this film without him. They had a stand-in double who acted as the priest and showed how he had faked the miracle and issued this. It's about a 12-minute film, and it's actually still on YouTube if you want to see it. But this was something that really showed in the early years of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, this extreme anti-Catholic party line that was being taken, and the lengths to which they were willing to utilize, at that time, quite new media of film to win over the public opinion and to shed this poor light on the Catholic Church. Anyway, the moral of the story is the state was targeting the church with these propaganda initiatives right from the beginning, and produced martyrs in so doing.
One thing we haven't mentioned is I see this when we have problems in America, a mass shooting or something, and people will go, "We need to pray," and then people say, "Enough of the prayer. That doesn't do any good." But really, wasn't it the prayer of the people who were suffering, who kept their faith and got down on their knees, that helped overthrow these communist governments?
There was actually a lot of progress that was made, including in the collapse of communism in Czechoslovakia, by prayer of the people and also peaceful public protest. And one theme that emerged from my interviews is that while these temporal victories were important and were goals, what was really the first and most important goal was to maintain one's own soul and to refuse to give in to any of the pressure to apostatize or to compromise with evil, because that is ultimately the final and also the first frontiers within your own soul and the battle for your own mind. So resisting the propaganda, for example, someone from Romania mentioned that during Nicolae Ceausescu's daily 3-hour rants on TV that the people were supposed to be listening to and imbibing, the family would just turn off the TV and either say the rosary or read together or do something else to fill their minds with truth and goodness rather than the lies of Ceausescu during that time. And we think that we would all be able to resist if we were placed in this situation, but when you're under this duress, especially in the more intense pressure cookers of the political prisons, for example, the communist message can become quite seductive, and it promises this worldly utopia, and it seeks to replace God and to give you everything that we are waiting for in heaven here on this earth. So even without the threats and the pressure, communism was selling something that sounded beautiful, and it just took a lot of discernment to see through that. So that was very important, to first and foremost protect your own mind, your own family. But after that, almost as an additional bonus stemming from that, was that this did have an effect on converting the nations and in actually defeating these regimes. So one example of this from Czechoslovakia, which is somewhat similar to what happened in Poland, is the candle demonstration, which was spearheaded by Mr. Miklosko, who I interview. And this turned into what's known as the Velvet Revolution or the Gentle Revolution in that country, because communism was overthrown peacefully and without hardly any violence, certainly not on the part of the resistors, sometimes on the part of the police from the regime. And this whole movement from 1988 to 1989 in Czechoslovakia began with a Marian pilgrimage, actually, to the Slovak town of Nitra, where Mr. Miklosko is from. And this sort of ballooned into these Catholic students, mostly many young people and secret priests, taking to the streets with their demands for not only religious freedom, but freedom in a more political sense. And many people who weren't even really religious sort of glommed onto this to stand up for their rights. And so what began really as a Catholic movement ultimately resulted in the entire nation standing up for their freedoms. And so that's just amazing, because we see things like the March for Life, for example, here in the US, and other protests that's kind of sometimes hard to keep the faith because it seems like we're just being ignored or it's something easily dismissed. But this does have the power to actually convert people around you and to ultimately, through God's power, bring about change.
I was thinking too, I don't know if we'll ever find out on this side until we get to the other side, but I wonder too how much the effect of grandpas teaching the faith to their grandkids and going to mass, even though it was so difficult, kept the faith alive. And I'm thinking of when Pope John Paul visited Cuba, 20 years ago or so. Millions came out, and we just so happy he was there, and they never lost faith. And
yeah, exactly. And many people who either gave up the faith to some degree, what I found is it's always still there. It's easily reactivated by either the stories of these saintly people, or just by something as simple as a pope who finally realizes this issue and takes it seriously. And alluding back to the battle for your own soul, I think it was very obvious that individual practice of the faith, including just individual prayer, was really important, because this this is something that was and people have often said they cannot yet control what's inside my mind. They can't read your mind yet. So it was funny that even some of the Bay of Pigs veterans talked about how their faith increased while they were in the prison camp, and they joked that, oh, there was nothing else to do. And that's true, but it's also that when you're in these sort of life and death situations, the four last things become a lot more clear, and you're able to see past a lot of the noise that we typically distract ourselves with in times of leisure in our day-to-day lives. And it put kind of our eternal perspective into greater focus.
Kristen, I want to thank you so much for joining me today on Mercy Unbound. People, Kristen, hold your mock-up of your book. It probably will be out when this show airs, but get it at sophiainstitute.com. She's done a tremendous amount of research. It's just well done, and it puts things in perspective of communism versus the church. So keep up the great work. We hope to see you back soon on Mercy Unbound. God bless everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please share, and we look forward to seeing you next time for Mercy Unbound. Thank you. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/drbryan, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again, and for more information, go to the website at drbryanThatcher.com.